You come into this world as a child who does not yet know where you end and where the other begins. In the earliest years of life, the psyche is porous, fluid, like a vessel not yet hardened by form. It receives impressions not only from what is spoken, but from what vibrates in silence. This is the origin of the empath who grows under the shadow of unspoken grief, whose earliest task was not the joyful discovery of self, but the subtle attunement to what was never said aloud. Such a child becomes a carrier, not of toys and stories, but of the hidden burdens that mother and father themselves could not acknowledge. And because the child's soul is still open to the invisible, it absorbs the atmospheres of sorrow, anger, and longing as naturally as the lungs inhale air. The home becomes a temple where unspoken rituals of pain are enacted, and the child, uninitiated, yet deeply initiated, becomes priest to mysteries they do not understand. In my work, I observed again and again how what is unconscious in the parent becomes destiny for the child. The repressed grief of the father, the unshed tears of the mother, these do not vanish. They circulate in the psychic field, awaiting a vessel strong enough to contain them. The empathic child, sensitive to currents others ignore, becomes that vessel. They do not choose this consciously. It is a fate bestowed by the interplay of archetype and circumstance. One might say that such a child bears the archetype of the wounded healer even before they know what a wound is. For to carry what is unacknowledged is to embody the shadow of the family. And the shadow, though hidden, demands incarnation. If you listen deeply to your own body, you may recognize this inheritance. Perhaps you feel a heaviness in your chest that was never entirely yours. Perhaps you carry anxieties that do not correspond to your own biography. Perhaps you replay dramas in your relationships that echo quarrels you witnessed but never understood. The psyche is not confined to the individual. It is interwoven with the family soul, which itself is but a thread in the greater tapestry of the collective unconscious. Thus, when we speak of the empath who carried their parents' pain, we are speaking of a soul entangled in archetypal drama, where the child becomes scapegoat and redeemer. Mirror in sacrifice. Dreams often reveal this mystery with merciless clarity. A dreamer might see themselves walking with a heavy sack upon their back, only to discover, upon opening it, that the sack is filled with their parents' faces, weeping silently. Another may dream of drowning, though the waters are not theirs, but flowing from an ancestral well. These are symbolic dramatizations of a psychic truth, that what is unspoken does not die, but seeks expression in the next generation. The empath becomes the medium through which the silence cries out, "This is not sentimental, it is tragic." And yet, in tragedy lies the seed of transformation, for what is carried unconsciously enslaves, but what is brought to light redeems. Consider the archetype of the child as divine bearer. In myth, the child often carries what the elders could not resolve. The Christ child bore the salvation of the world, though the world did not recognize him. The young Buddha carried the suffering of humanity, though he was born into a palace of denial. Even in Greek myth, Orestes must avenge the hidden crimes of his parents. The empathic child is a living enactment of this eternal pattern, but unlike the mythic hero, they often have no guide, no oracle to interpret their burden. Instead, they internalize the message, if my parents are unhappy, it must be because of me. This is the child's tragic misinterpretation of archetypal inheritance. Where silence reigns, the child fills it with guilt. And so adulthood arrives clothed in patterns of self-sacrifice, compulsive caretaking, and a relentless sense of responsibility for others' moods. The empath becomes skilled at reading what is unsaid in the room, adjusting their own being to stabilize the fragile balance of others. This is mistaken for virtue, and indeed it contains a seed of virtue, but it is also pathology, for it denies the individual's own soul. To live forever in service to what is unconscious in others is to remain chained to the family shadow. One may achieve external harmony, but inwardly the self withers. Jung wrote that the greatest burden a child must bear is the unlived life of the parent. The empath bears this in a literal sense, for they not only feel it, they enact it. But let us not despair. The psyche does not create such patterns to destroy us. It creates them to initiate us. The wound is the way in. The empath who carried their parents' unspoken pain has been apprenticed, albeit unconsciously, in the mysteries of the soul. They have learned to hear what is inaudible, to sense what is invisible. These are the very capacities that, when purified of unconscious compulsion, to become gifts for healing and vision. The task, then, is not to rid oneself of sensitivity, but to differentiate it, to say, this grief is mine, this grief is not, this shadow belongs to my father, this longing belongs to my mother, and I release myself from the compulsion to live their unlived lives. Such differentiation is an act of individuation, a severing that makes possible true compassion. We must imagine the empath not only as a wounded child, but as an alchemist. The raw lead of inherited sorrow can, through consciousness, be transmuted into gold. But alchemy is not easy. It requires descent into the unconscious, confrontation with shadow, and acceptance of one's own darkness. The empath must face that they are not only carrier of others' wounds, but bearer of their own repressed rage, guilt, and desire. To acknowledge this is to step into the underworld, and like Orpheus, one must not look away too quickly, or the treasure will vanish. What, then, is the treasure? It is the discovery that sensitivity is not weakness but perception. It is the realization that one can love without carrying. It is the revelation that the soul is vast enough to honor the pain of the ancestors without confusing it for one's own. Individuation requires this disentanglement. Only then can the empath become healer rather than hostage. But beware of spiritual inflation, the temptation to believe that because you feel so much, you are somehow chosen or superior. Sensitivity without grounding becomes a flood that drowns both self and other. True empathy requires boundaries, for without them there is no differentiation, and without differentiation there is no self. The danger is to confuse fusion with love, martyrdom with compassion. Jung insisted that the self seeks wholeness, not sacrifice. Wholeness includes the capacity to say no, to withdraw projections, to return the unlived life of the parents to its rightful owners. Imagine for a moment that you stand in a darkened room where your parents' shadows loom upon the walls. For years you mistook these shadows as your own form, but now, with the candle of consciousness in hand, you approach them. You see the contours clearly. This fear was never yours. This silence belonged to them. This anger echoes from their unspoken battles as you name them. The shadows retreat, for shadows cannot withstand the light of awareness, and as they recede, your own form emerges, distinct and luminous. This is individuation, the reclamation of your soul from the ghosts of the past. And yet, individuation is not rejection. You do not cast away your parents' pain in disdain. You honor it, for it made you who you are. You bow before the mystery that such burdens sculpted your sensitivity. But you no longer confuse honoring with carrying. You recognize that the greater gift you can give your lineage is to live your own life fully, to break the cycle of unconscious repetition. The empath who individuates becomes not a carrier of wounds, but a guardian of wisdom. As you listen now, notice how your own psyche resonates with this archetypal story. Perhaps you recognize the weight upon your shoulders, or the silence you inherited, or the compulsions that drive your relationships. Do not turn away. To see clearly is the first step of liberation, for what remains unconscious rules us from the dark, but what is made conscious releases us into freedom. The empath's journey is thus both a burden and a blessing, a descent into the underworld of ancestral shadow, and a rising into the light of individuation. And here lies the paradox. That which once felt like imprisonment becomes the very path to liberation. That which seemed curse reveals itself as initiation. The empath, once a child bound by silence, becomes an adult who speaks with clarity, who feels with depth, who sees with vision. And in this transformation, they not only redeem themselves, but also release the ancestors whose unspoken pain they carried, for consciousness ripples backward as well as forward, healing not only the living but also the dead. This is the mystery of psychic inheritance. It binds, but it also offers. It wounds, but it also awakens. To be the empath who carried their parents' unspoken pain is to be chosen, not for suffering alone, but for the possibility of transfiguration. To carry the pain of one's parents is to live with ghosts, not the kind that rattle chains or wander through abandoned houses, but the invisible ghosts of silence, of suppressed words, of tears never shed. These hauntings are more persistent than any specter because they live not outside us, but within our very breath. Within the architecture of our nervous system, the empath learns this haunting without ever naming it. They think it is love to feel everything. They think it is loyalty to bend under weight that was never theirs to bear. But in truth, it is possession, and to live possessed by ancestral grief is to confuse inheritance with identity. Let me speak plainly. The psyche of the empath becomes a battlefield where the unlived lives of the parents clash with the emerging self of the child. What mother could not express, the child enacts in dream. What father suppressed, the child reproduces in relationship. The empath believes they are choosing freely, but they are moved by invisible strings tied to the unconscious of the family. This is not imagination. It is the nature of the psyche, for the unconscious, when unacknowledged, demands expression, and if the parents cannot embody it, then it is the children who do. Have you ever asked yourself why certain feelings come like storms, uninvited, disproportionate to the moment? Why you feel despair at a simple silence, rage at a small rejection, exhaustion at a glance from another? This is the language of the unconscious, speaking with the weight of generations. The empath becomes interpreter of this language, but at first they misinterpret. They believe the pain is theirs, that they are deficient, fragile, broken. They do not realize that they are listening to echoes, not to their own voice. In one patient's dream, I recall the image of a house with many locked rooms. In each room, a child was crying. Though the dreamer could not reach them, the dream revealed what consciousness had long denied, that in the family soul there were many locked chambers of sorrow, sealed by silence. But the empath within the family could hear the cries nonetheless. This dream is archetypal, for each family has such hidden rooms, and the empath hears them most clearly. But the task of individuation is to open the doors not by force, but by recognition. To acknowledge what was unacknowledged is the first step toward freedom. You must understand that the empath sensitivity is double-edged. It grants vision into the invisible, but it also binds them to repetition. Without consciousness, they remain fixated, reliving the trauma they never endured personally, yet carried as if it were their own. This fixation is why empaths so often find themselves drawn to wounded partners, broken friends, volatile environments. It is not accident, but compulsion. The psyche seeks to recreate the original wound, hoping at last to redeem it. But redemption cannot come by repetition. It can only come by recognition. The myth of Persephone illustrates this descent. She is taken into the underworld, carrying the grief of her mother, Demeter, who wanders in despair. Persephone's task is not merely to suffer, but to rule in the underworld, to transform her captivity into sovereignty. So it is with the empath. They must enter the dark places, the inherited grief, but they must not remain captives. They must become sovereign in the underworld, able to walk between shadow and light, to feel without drowning, to honor, without carrying. This is the mark of individuation. But how, you may ask, does one begin such a transformation? It begins by noticing the voice of guilt that whispers, if I let go, they will fall apart. If I claim my life, I am betraying them. If I refuse to carry, I am ungrateful. This is the ancient curse that binds empaths to servitude. It is the curse of identification. But guilt is not the voice of the soul. It is the voice of the complex. A complex is a splinter of psychic energy charged with memory and emotion, which operates autonomously like a little personality within the psyche. The empath often lives under the tyranny of a parental complex, replaying old dramas with new actors. To become conscious of the complex is to rob it of its power. I recall another dream. A young woman saw herself carrying her mother on her back through a desert. The mother was silent, heavy, unmoving. At last, in exhaustion, the dreamer collapsed, and in that moment, the mother transformed into a small child who walked beside her. The dream revealed that the empath had carried not only her mother's sorrow, but her mother's own inner child, neglected and wounded. By putting the burden down, she allowed the transformation. So too must we learn to set down the burden, not in cruelty, but in trust that the parents' unlived life is theirs to reclaim, not ours to enact. But there is resistance, for the archetype of the savior is powerful. The empath feels chosen, and to relinquish the role feels like betrayal. Yet one cannot individuate while playing savior to another's shadow. Individuation demands that we save ourselves first, that we descend into our own depths, that we claim our own pain as distinct from the inherited pain. Only then can we offer true compassion, which is not rescue but recognition. The empath's gift, once purified, is profound. They become seers of the soul, able to perceive the subtle currents of collective life. They become artists, healers, visionaries, not because they are bound to others' wounds, but because they have learned to transform sensitivity into wisdom. But if they cling to the parental pain as identity, they remain trapped in the role of martyr, consumed by sorrows that were never theirs. This is why the work of shadow is essential. The empath must look not only at the pain they carried, but also at the shadow it created within themselves: resentment, rage, even a secret desire to dominate by caretaking. To see these is to free oneself from false virtue and to step into authentic wholeness. The alchemical process describes this journey. The nigredo, the blackening, is the stage where the empath confronts the weight of inherited sorrow, the darkness that seems endless. But from nigredo emerges albedo, the whitening, where clarity and distinction arise. The empath learns to separate what is theirs from what is not. Finally comes rubedo, the reddening, the union of opposites, where the empath embraces both sensitivity and autonomy, compassion and boundary, feeling and differentiation. This is not an intellectual exercise. It is a transformation of the soul, earned through suffering and illuminated by consciousness. And so, if you find within yourself the mark of the empath, do not despise it. Do not curse the sensitivity that made you carrier of unspoken pain, but also do not mistake it for your essence. You are more than the burdens you inherited. You are a soul called to wholeness. To individuate is to honor both the gift and the wound, to transform the haunting into wisdom, to walk no longer as vessel of other silence, but as voice of your own truth. When you begin to speak what was never spoken, when you give words to the silence that shaped you, you break the spell, and in breaking it, you not only free yourself, but also offer freedom to those who came before you and to those who will come after. For consciousness is contagious. It ripples through the lineage like light entering a darkened house. The empath who individuates becomes a torchbearer, illuminating paths once hidden. This is the path before you. Do not shrink from it. The weight you carried was never meant to define you, but to initiate you. The silence you inherited was never meant to mute you, but to call forth your voice. In the mystery of the psyche, what once enslaved becomes the very key to liberation. There comes a point in the life of every empath where the inherited sorrow feels unbearable. It is as though the blood itself is heavy with memory, as though the marrow of the bones contains whispers of grief. And yet, this unbearable weight is also the threshold. The psyche does not give us more than we can bear without also giving us the possibility of transformation. The unbearable is the alchemical fire, the heat that breaks down the structures of false identity so that something more enduring might emerge. What you think is your breaking is often your initiation. Dreams in such moments are often filled with images of sacrifice. One may dream of being bound to an altar, or of carrying a cross, or of standing before a tribunal accused of crimes never committed. These are archetypal dramatizations of the empath's unconscious conviction that they must pay for the sins of the parents, that they must atone for what was never theirs. But here we must remember, sacrifice is not always destruction. In the ancient mysteries, sacrifice was the giving up of what was lesser in order to receive what was greater. For the empath, the sacrifice required is not their life, not their soul, but their false identification with the parents' pain. They must offer up the illusion that they were born to carry it. To release this illusion is terrifying. It feels like betrayal, it feels like death, and in a sense, it is a death. The death of an identity formed around wounds, not one's own, but in this death is rebirth. Individuation always requires a symbolic death, the dissolution of an old structure so that a new form might be born. The empath who dares to set down the inherited burden enters into a liminal state, a threshold where nothing feels certain, where the old roles have dissolved, but the new self has not yet taken form. This is a necessary darkness, the incubation of the emerging self. The archetype of the phoenix speaks here, burned to ashes. The bird does not end, but rises transformed. The empath, consumed by fire of ancestral sorrow, discovers in the ashes a deeper truth, that their essence was never the burden, but the flame that survives it. This flame is consciousness, the spark of the divine self, indestructible, eternal. When you realize that what you carried was never your essence, you begin to burn with this inner fire. But do not think the process is linear. The psyche moves in spirals. One moment of freedom is followed by another descent, another confrontation with shadow. The empath may lay down the burden only to pick it up again in subtle ways. They may find themselves once more entangled in relationships where they play savior, once more overwhelmed by feelings that are not theirs. This is not failure. It is the nature of transformation. Each spiral brings deeper awareness, greater differentiation. One does not conquer the unconscious in a single battle. One learns to live in relationship with it. The archetype of the wounded healer returns here. The empath's very wound becomes the source of their wisdom, because they know what it is to carry what is not theirs. They can recognize this pattern in others, because they have suffered the weight of silence. They can speak words that break the spell for others. The danger is to mistake the wound for identity, to cling to it as justification for existence. But if the empath accepts the wound as teacher rather than tyrant, then it becomes a gateway. Through it they enter the depths of the psyche, and through it they discover the universality of suffering. In this way, the personal wound is transfigured into a collective offering. We must also speak of anger, for this is often the hidden twin of empathy. The empath who has carried too much will eventually feel rage, though they may repress it for fear of hurting others. This rage, when denied, festers into resentment, into exhaustion, into despair. But when acknowledged, it reveals its wisdom. Anger shows where the boundary has been crossed. The empath must learn to listen to their anger as a guide, not as an enemy. Anger says, "This is not yours. Return it." To heed this voice is not cruelty, it is truth. And in truth lies healing. Imagine for a moment that your parents stand before you, carrying their own burdens. You, the empathic child, step forward, instinctively, ready to shoulder them. But now, with new consciousness, you stop, you bow to them in reverence, acknowledging their suffering, their humanity, and then you speak. What is yours is yours. What is mine is mine. I honor your pain, but I no longer carry it. In this moment, the spell is broken. You have returned the burden to its rightful owners, not with contempt, but with love. And in so doing, you free not only yourself, but also them, for their unlived lives are no longer hidden within you. They are returned to their own soul, where they belong. This ritual, whether enacted outwardly or inwardly, is essential for the empath. It severs the unconscious fusion between self and parent, between child and ancestor. It makes space for the true self to emerge, and when the self emerges, it does not erase empathy, but it refines it, no longer compelled by unconscious guilt. Empathy becomes compassion, no longer enslaved to repetition. Empathy becomes choice, no longer bound to the shadow of the family. Empathy becomes light for the collective, for we must not forget that the empath is not only a family phenomenon, but also a collective one. The sensitivity that once bound them to parental sorrow is the same sensitivity that allows them to perceive the collective unconscious. They feel the suffering of the world, the wounds of humanity, the unspoken despair of the age. This is why so many empaths become artists, mystics, healers, revolutionaries. They give form to what the collective denies. They speak the silence not only of their parents, but of their culture, their people, their time. This is a heavy calling, and without individuation, it crushes them, but with individuation, it elevates them into instruments of transformation. Thus, the empath's journey mirrors the archetypal journey of the hero, descent into shadow, confrontation with unconscious forces, death of false identity, rebirth into the self, yet it is a quieter heroism, one lived not with swords and battles, but with silence and tears, with dreams and awakenings. It is no less profound. Indeed, it may be the very heroism our time requires, not conquest of the outer world, but integration of the inner one. As I speak these words, perhaps you feel within yourself the stirring of recognition. Perhaps you sense that you too have been carrying more than is yours. Perhaps you see how this burden has shaped your choices, your loves, your sorrows. Do not recoil. To see is the beginning of freedom. The unconscious becomes less dangerous the moment it is recognized. What was once a haunting becomes an image, a symbol, a story, and what can be symbolized can be integrated. The empath's gift is precisely this capacity for symbolization. They feel what others cannot, and in feeling, they give it form. When they dream not only their own psyche, but also the collective. When they create, they bring forth not only their own soul, but also the soul of their time. This is why the empath, once individuated, becomes a vessel not of inherited pain, but of collective wisdom. Their wound becomes the channel through which the unconscious speaks, and through which healing flows. The path is not easy. It is fraught with temptations. The temptation to remain martyr, the temptation to cling to the role of savior, the temptation to drown in the collective suffering. But if the empath learns to stand at the threshold, to feel without fusing, to honor without carrying, then they embody a rare balance. They become not only healers of others, but guardians of their own soul. And this is the true mark of individuation, not the abandonment of others, but the integration of self, so that one's service flows from fullness rather than emptiness, from wholeness rather than wound. And so I tell you, if you are the empath who carried your parents' unspoken pain, your task is great, but so is your possibility. You were never meant to remain a prisoner of their silence. You were meant to bring it to speech, to transform it into wisdom, to release it into the light. This is the path of the soul. This is the mystery of transformation. And if you walk it faithfully, you will discover that what once felt like curse is in truth your greatest gift. The path of the empath is not meant to remain forever bound to sorrow. It is a preparation, a calling, a difficult initiation into the mysteries of the human soul, to carry what was unspoken, to feel what others denied, to inhabit silence as though it were one's native tongue. This was never intended as your prison, but as your apprenticeship, for it is precisely through the crucible of inherited grief that you develop the eyes to see beyond illusion, the ears to hear what is whispered in dreams, the heart to perceive what lies beneath masks. But the apprenticeship must end. The child who once carried must one day set the burden down and stand as an individual, luminous with their own truth. Individuation is not escape, it is integration. You do not cast away the family, nor deny the parents, nor despise the ancestors. You recognize them, honor them, and then you differentiate. You bow to their story, but claim your own. This is the delicate balance of Jung's vision, to live not in rebellion against the past, nor in fusion with it, but in dialogue with it, to say, I see you, and I thank you, but I must now live as myself. This is the act that transforms unconscious inheritance into conscious legacy. In myths across cultures, this moment is portrayed as the hero leaving home. It is Theseus setting sail. It is Odysseus leaving Ithaca. It is the Buddha walking out of his father's palace. The empath's version of this departure is more subtle, more inward, but no less heroic. It is the leaving behind of identities formed by silence, the relinquishing of burdens adopted out of loyalty. It is a journey into the wilderness of the self, where no map exists except the voice of the unconscious. Dreams now become companions rather than hauntings. Where once they screamed with the pain of others, now they whisper with guidance for the self. You may dream of walking through a house once filled with shadows, but now the windows are open and sunlight streams in. You may dream of returning a heavy object to its rightful owner and walking away lighter. These are not mere images, they are milestones of individuation, signs that the psyche is releasing what no longer belongs to you. Yet even in this liberation, humility is essential, for the unconscious is vast, and the temptation of inflation lurks. The empath, having suffered deeply, may believe themselves chosen, superior, destined for greatness by virtue of their pain. This is a subtle trap, for the ego, inflated by archetypal energies, mistakes itself for the self. Jung warned often of this danger. True individuation is marked not by superiority but by wholeness, by the quiet integration of shadow and light, by the acceptance of one's humanity alongside one's divinity. And what does wholeness mean for the empath? It means the ability to feel without dissolving, to love without losing oneself, to honor others' pain without being consumed by it. It means transforming empathy into compassion, which recognizes suffering without identifying with it. Compassion is stronger than empathy because it is rooted in differentiation. The empath, once bound by guilt, now acts from freedom. They may choose to help or choose to rest. Both are acts of love when chosen consciously. Consider the archetype of the healer in its shadow form. It is the martyr who sacrifices endlessly, who believes that suffering is virtue, who bleeds so that others may live, but in its individuated form. It is the wise healer who knows that true healing flows from wholeness, not depletion. The individuated empath becomes such a healer not necessarily in profession, but in presence. Their very being communicates balance. Their life itself becomes medicine. They need not save. Their authenticity liberates others. At this stage, the empath also discovers joy. For too long, they equated love with sorrow, loyalty with silence. Now they discover that love can also be laughter, that loyalty can also be truth, that presence can also be lightness. They reclaim the playfulness of the child, not the burdened child who carried, but the original child archetype, innocent, creative, to free. This return to joy is not regression, but completion. It is a self-restoring what was lost, redeeming the years consumed by silence. And in this joy, the empath recognizes their role in the greater collective. For just as they once carried their parents' unspoken pain, so too does humanity carry unspoken sorrows, wars never grieved, injustices never named, traumas never healed. The individuated empath becomes a mirror for the collective, showing that what was unspoken can indeed be voiced, that what was carried in silence can indeed be transformed. They become agents of collective healing, not by taking on the world's pain, but by embodying the possibility of liberation. Their life testifies. It is possible to feel deeply and still be free. And this is no small contribution in an age where silence breeds despair, where repression festers into violence. The presence of one conscious empath is like a torch in darkness. Their light does not erase the dark, but it makes the dark visible, and in visibility lies choice. The collective too can choose to individuate, to bring forth what has been denied, to heal the wounds of history. The empath who has individuated stands as a forerunner of this possibility. So, if you recognize yourself in this story, do not despair. Your burden was never meaningless. It was the path carved for you by the unconscious, leading you into depths few dared to enter. You have felt what was unspoken so that you might one day speak it. You have carried what was denied so that you might one day release it. You have lived as vessel of others' shadows so that you might one day embody your own light. This is your calling, not to remain burdened, but to transform. And transformation is not a single event. It is a lifelong journey, a spiral unfolding. You will lay the burden down many times, and many times you will pick it up again, perhaps without noticing, but each time you recognize, each time you release, each time you return to yourself, you walk further into wholeness. This is the work of the soul. This is the mystery of individuation. Do not seek perfection, for perfection belongs to the gods. Seek wholeness, which belongs to humanity. Wholeness includes your sensitivity and your boundaries, your compassion and your anger, your light and your shadow. Wholeness is not purity, it is integration. And in this integration, the empath who once carried their parents' unspoken pain becomes a full human being. Luminous with the light of the self, so let the silence be broken, let the unspoken be named, let the burdens be returned, and let the empath, once a child of sorrow, become at last a child of light. For the soul was never meant to remain hostage to the past. It was meant to awaken, to transform, to live. And when you live fully, you redeem not only yourself, but also those who came before you and those who will come after. This is the true inheritance, not the pain you carried, but the freedom you embody. And so I leave you with this. The pain you carried was real, but it was never yours. The silence you inhabited was deep, but it was never your final word. Your final word is freedom. Your final truth is wholeness. Your final destiny is to be fully yourself. Walk this path with courage, for though it is difficult, it leads always toward the self, and in the self, everything you carried finds meaning, and everything you were becomes whole.